Now, can you imagine watching your son go off to war? He's killed in action in a faraway country. You have no idea where to find his grave. Australian soldier Vince Healy was 24 when he lost his life in Korea. The war raged from 1950 to 1953, claiming the lives of 339 Australians. For 10 years after Vince's death, his mother Thelma scrimped and saved the money to go to South Korea to find where Vince was buried. In 1961, without ever having left Australia before, Thelma set off alone to Korea, and what she discovered began an enduring friendship between two families from two very different nations over 3 generations. Thelma's story is the subject of a book called Passage to Pusan, plus a documentary and an exhibition. And the woman who brought the story to life, Thelma's granddaughter, Louise Evans, is here. Welcome to you, Louise. Thanks for coming in.
Hi, Chris. Great to see you in radio mode.
This is, yes, well, I don't know. You might not think that by the end of this interview. but you've got a book, a documentary and an exhibition. Thelma's story must be some story. Take us through it.
It wasn't until 3 years ago, Chris, when my Aunt Tricia handed me Thelma's travel diary. Growing up, I'd heard stories of what my grandmother had done and had she gone on this amazing self-funded solo trip in 1961, aged 55. And of course, I grew up hearing stories about my Uncle Vince, who died when he was 24, as you mentioned. Very brave, very generous, very kind boy, who was actually the lifeblood of the family. Thelma had 10 children. Vince was her eldest. The father was absent, and his wages, of course, helped support the family. So when he died, he not only broke his mother's heart, but it almost broke the family as well. But Thelma vowed that before she died, she would find Vince's grave. And as you said, it took her 10 years to scrimp and save to make the journey. Fast forward to 2014, when the family, I suppose, being a journalist, I'd like to ask her, few questions, and they said, "Oh, someone should give Louise Thelma's diary." And I said, "Oh, she had a travel diary," and it emerged from the bottom of a drawer. And I read the diary, and the gravity of what she had achieved really hit me. And I thought, I need to write her story. So I spent another 2 years researching her life and that of Vince. And then in January 2016, I was able to publish the book Passage to Pusan.
So how did Thelma get to Korea in 1961 as a woman on her own? It's pretty incredible that she chose to do that.
Yeah, she was a woman who would not, she was on a mission, Chris, and she didn't have a lot of money. She worked in the Golden Circle pineapple factory in Brisbane, backbreaking work, peeling pineapples, paid a pittance, in a hot shed, dermatitis on her hand. She'd already had 10 children, so her back wasn't too good either. Varicose veins, you can imagine what it would have been like. But finally, when she had enough money to go, she still had to find the cheapest way to get to Korea. Now, South Korea, even in 1961, 8 years after the Korean War, was still a war-torn country, very much on its knees, a lot of civil strife, a lot of poverty. And the way Thelma got there, it took her 10 days back then in 1961 to get from Brisbane to Seoul. Of course, today you fly from Sydney to Seoul in 10 hours, but it took my grandmother 10 days. She took a boat to the Orient, as they called it back then, from Brisbane to Japan. She then took a train from the port to the airport. She then flew to Seoul and then flew to Pusan, which is in the south of the country on the coast, which is the graveyard where her son, my uncle Vince, is buried.
Did she have any idea where he was when she was heading there?
She knew that he was in this graveyard, but that's really all she knew.
And did she know how to find it?
She initially, the army didn't want her to go. They tried to stop her, but she was very determined. And eventually the army got behind her and they met her at the airport in Seoul and they escorted her down. Because I don't think the army wanted this to be a bad news story. They didn't want any. She was the first bereaved mother to visit the graveyard, to visit, her son's grave. And I don't think that they wanted it to turn pear-shaped.
Now, there's a South Korean family involved here. Tell us about that.
It's a beautiful story. It's chapter 11, Mrs. Kim. So when my grandmother went to Seoul in 1961, her story, because it was, considered quite a feat, it was published in a Seoul newspaper, and it really touched a nerve in a lady by the name of Kim Chung-kun. She was a Korean War widow. Her husband had died in the Korean War, and she recognised the grief of a mother forever separated from her son and never to be able to visit his grave. So she read this story and she vowed that she would become Vince's Korean mother, and that every year she would go to his grave, long way from Seoul to Pusan, 325 kilometres, and that once a year she would lay flowers on his grave on behalf of Thelma, on behalf of his mother.
And how's your family stayed in touch? What's the connection now? Because it's crossed 3 generations, this story.
It has. So Mrs. Kim reached out to my grandmother. Back then, of course, no email, no internet. So she wrote to the Korean embassy in Australia. She wrote a letter to my grandmother and sent it to the Korean embassy in Australia and asked the Korean embassy to find Thelma. And the Koreans are very smart people, very industrious, very hardworking, and they found Thelma. They translated the letter and they got it to Thelma. And, of course, the grandmothers became pen pals, as you did back then. And unfortunately, the 2 grandmothers never got to meet. My grandmother died when she was 66. And Mrs. Kim Chung-kun lived until 2014. But as a result of the book being published, I am now friends with her granddaughter, Gracie Kim, who lives in Sydney with her 2 daughters, Brioni and Eli. So the granddaughters of the grandmothers are now Facebook pals.
And in the same city.
And in the same city.
Now, how did this become an exhibition and what's in it?
Yes, so the exhibition, the Korean Cultural Council of Australia, the Korean Cultural Centre of Australia, which is based here in Sydney in Elizabeth Street opposite Hyde Park, the cultural arm of the South Korean government, they read the book, and I think it touched the same kind of nerve as it did in Mrs. Kim, and they've taken the book and they've turned it into an exhibition which opens today for 2 months, and a very talented photo artist by the name of Soyeon Kim has taken the book and she's interpreted in terms of she's done some amazing work. We had the opening on Friday night. She's done an unfolding book that goes the length of a wall. She's created boats filled with water with multiple layers of photographs to represent Thelma Healy and Mrs. Kim and Pusan and Sangate, where my uncle grew up. She's also got hanji paper, which is the traditional Korean paper made from wood. And she's superimposed letters and photographs behind it. It's very, very beautiful. There were a number of people who I didn't even know at the exhibition opening who came up to me in floods of tears because it was a very moving story, and to see it executed so beautifully in terms of an exhibition really moved a lot of people, and me, of course, too. It's very emotional for me.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's like 2 very, very different cultures, but that sort of universal theme of love and devotion is the central theme to all of it. It sounds quite incredible. When's the documentary out?
So there's not content just to have an exhibition. The Korean Cultural Centre have also thrown their support and, more importantly, their money and their creative genius behind a documentary. And in May, I was lucky enough to go to Korea, 10 days, over 1,000 kilometres, 2 minibuses, 9 Koreans and myself, retracing my grandmother's footsteps. A very challenging journey, very emotional journey, but very educational journey. And the documentary, just 1 more week of filming back here in Australia, and the documentary is going to be done and dusted, believe it or not, by mid-August, when it's going to be launched as part of the Korean Film Festival that's held in Australia every year and goes to every capital city, starting in Sydney in mid-August.
Well, incredible cooperation between 2 countries who are at war with each other. It sounds quite amazing. Thank you so much for coming in. It's a beautiful story, your grandmother's story, and it must be hard for you to talk about, but wow, it just sounds just incredible.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks. So that is Louise Evans there, the author of Passage to Pusan, about her grandmother, Thelma Healy, and her incredible voyage to her son's grave in South Korea. And if you would like to know more about it, the book's out now. And, of course, the exhibition that Louise was talking about has opened at the Korean Cultural Centre in Elizabeth Street in the CBD. It's there for a couple of months so that you can go and see it. Let's check the traffic for you now.